Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dantel Proctor from the National Student Attendance, Engagement, and Success Center. Welcome to today's webinar, Using Early Warning Systems to Overcome Poverty's Influence on Absenteeism. Before we get started, I would like to share some brief details about today's webinar. Our presenter is Dr. Richard Lofton, Jr., an assistant professor in the School of Education at the Center for Social Organization of Schools. He is a graduate of Teachers College, Columbia University, and recently completed a 2-year postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Social Organization of Schools. Dr. Lofton's research examines the impact of concentrated poverty on homes, schools, and communities. Currently, he is using qualitative methods to understand how West Baltimorean youth understand social mobility, educational opportunities, and systemic opportunities. In addition, he is the co-principal investigator of the National Evaluation of School Success Mentor Initiative. Today's webinar will last for approximately 60 minutes with time for questions. We will be placing everyone on mute. Please do not unmute yourself, but instead refer to the chat function on the top of the screen if you have a question. Please feel free to log your questions as Dr. Lofton is talking, and we will leave some time at the end to answer them. If we do not have enough time to get through all of the questions, we will reply to all participants by email within the next 5 to 7 days. We encourage you to ask questions or simply share a comment. Today's webinar is one of a number being offered by the Technical Assistance Center during 2017. The center is new. It is funded by the Department of Education, specifically the Office of Safe and Healthy Students. Our website is currently being developed, and we hope to have it up and running soon. Before I hand over to Dr. Lofton, I want to share with you the mission of our National Center. The mission of the center is to disseminate evidence-based practices and build and facilitate communities of practice to help students attend every day, be engaged in school, and succeed academically so that they graduate high school prepared for college, career, and civic life. Dr. Lofton, I pass it off to you now.
Thank you, Dantel, for that wonderful introduction. I hope everyone is doing well. Before I begin, I would like to thank Bob Belfant for allowing me the opportunity of a postdoctoral fellow for 2 years to focus on concentrated poverty and its impact on student success. I also would like to thank Maria Waltmeyer for her support and help with this presentation. Today, I am aiming to accomplish 2 goals, right? The first one is for us to get a better understanding of how concentrated poverty can impact students' attendance. The second goal is to work together to reduce chronic absenteeism through data-driven approaches that inform tiered interventions. So let's begin. In our next slide, you will see that there's a map of the United States, and it illustrates that students experience chronic absenteeism from coast to coast. Approximately 500 school districts reported that 30% or more of their students missed at least 3 weeks of school in 2013 through 2014. The dark purple areas are the places where 30% or more of the students were chronically absent. So this goes on to the next slide. So what is the question? Where is chronic absentee concentrated? That's a good question. Well, in the next slide, you will see that half of the nation's chronically absent students were concentrated in 4% of the school districts in this nation. When we unpack these areas, right, we discovered that these students were mostly African American and Latino students. Also, in these school districts, we see that a lot of these students are faced with concentrated poverty. We also discovered that some of the places with the largest number of chronically absent students are affluent suburban school districts known for academic success. When we unpack these affluent school districts, we see that often there is an influx of working class people and minorities in these schools who are chronically absent. This connects with so much of the research I have been conducting in suburban schools for the last 8 years. Often working class and minority students' educational needs are not being met, and some of these students do not believe they fully belong in the school. As well, what I discovered when I was looking at suburban school, looking at the needs of working class and minority students, that many of them were in lower track classes. These students are wrestling with the racial and class identities in these affluent places. So we need to bring this aware to administrators. Let's go to the next slide. But chronic absenteeism is just not an urban and suburban issue. As I mentioned earlier, that 500 school districts exceed 30% chronic absentee rate. Well, what I did not mention is that the district that reported this rate were rural, a lot of them were rural districts. Many small, poor, rural school districts have few students but face high rates of chronic absenteeism. Many of these districts have small minority population. In some of these rural areas and towns, we have high rates of chronic absenteeism and poverty among white students. Let's move to the next slide. While we do know some research regarding some of the contributing factors, we're still looking for more answers. But we do know a little bit about what is causing some students to not to come to school every single day. And there are serious barriers that students face trying to get to school every day. This is particularly true in poor and working class areas. One barrier that I think we often forget about is health care and chronic absenteeism. Chronic health with students and parents. Another issue that I discovered in my research is trauma and intergenerational trauma. Some parents are dealing with trauma, and then students are dealing with trauma, as well as transportation and also homelessness. Another key finding that I'm finding in my research when I examine areas of concentrated poverty is that some parents are actually dealing with substance abuse issues, which is also causing some other issues when it comes to barriers that students are facing. Another contributing factor is the disengagement. Often in these situations, there is not a connection with the educational process and how students are making sense of their social world. In other words, schools are not able to connect students' social world to the educational experiences in a classroom, which leads students to be disengaged. There are others that are also causing, that are contributing factors to chronic absenteeism, and that is also myths, right? There are also myths that we have to confront when it comes to chronic absenteeism. For example, you can only miss a couple of days of school, or absences are only a problem if they are unexcused. Coming from Los Angeles, often I heard when it rains, actually you don't have to go to school, it's not that important. So there's myths that we have to really think about when we think about some of the contributing factors that's causing chronic absenteeism. But not only that, aversion as well. Sometimes we forget that students often have their own personal struggles. They're dealing with their own personal issues. Students are dealing with peer relationships and self-esteem issues, intergenerational trauma and trauma that they're experiencing, as well as mental health and also undiagnosed disabilities. So let's move on to the next one. We designed this to help people get a better understanding of some of the struggles that students in concentrated poverty are facing when it comes to getting to school every day. When we start off with 8 students leaving the house, but only end up with one that actually make it to the school door. In this illustration, students are confronted with asthma, caring for siblings, transportation issues, the fear of being detained or reported because of immigration status, dental issues, and no clean clothes. So you can see that people in certain areas are still dealing with a lot of issues that we still have not been able to confront, and we have to acknowledge and try to confront these in the best way that we know how. So let's look at the next slide. So let's get a better understanding of poverty. When people experience poverty, they can experience it in 2 ways. First, it can be an individual family experience, and secondly, it can be a communal experience. What do I mean by that? Poverty as an individual family experience is related to having enough money to acquire the basics like food, shelter, clothes, and medicine. But there is also a communal experience when people are dealing with their family poverty, but also people around them are faced with poverty. When an area is 30% or more in poverty, we call them concentrated poverty areas. Even more disappointing, usually within these areas, we see that their social structures are not as strong as in other places. And what I mean by that, I found that in these communities, students and people actually receive different type of policing. Usually there is a history of school districts not fully meeting the educational needs of all of the students, as well as we see an unequal distribution of resources and opportunities in these areas. Let's move on to the next slide. So the question is now, who is in poverty? If we find the federal census definition, we will see that a household of four that makes $24,000 a year is at the federal poverty level. So you can say they are at 100% of that poverty, right? Well, low income is 200% or less of the federal poverty level. And that means a household of four is around $48,500. And then extreme poverty is a household of four is $12,125 or below. We can move to the next slide. So when we look at low income, that is people at 100 to 199% of the poverty level, we see that 60 million people in the United States are low income, and we also see that 16 million children, around 22%, are low income in the United States. 25.6 million people in the United States are experiencing poverty. About 6.8 million children, 12%, are experiencing poverty. And then extreme poverty is 20.4 million and about 7.2 million children. When we add this all up, 106 million people are dealing with economic hardship, and 31.8 million children, about 44%, are experiencing economic hardship. What we constantly find when we think about these areas and these people who are experiencing this hardship, that often it's intergenerational, from one generation to another generation. Often, these people never leave their areas, and there are also a lack of resources and opportunities in these areas. We also find that in these areas that the same families that are faced with economic hardship are some of the same families whose children struggle to get to school every single day. So let's move on to the next slide, because that then leads to the next question. Why are the students and families faced with economic hardship are the same ones struggling to get to school every day? One of the reasons I discovered is that living in areas of concentrated poverty causes additional burdens on students and parents. These students are living in communities where there is a higher rate of crime and violence, poor housing conditions, fewer job opportunities, and lack of access to healthy foods. In these communities, many of these people are trying to just survive. Let's move to the next one. Some of the research that comes out of New York City really helps us understand why the same students that are confronted with economic hardship are the same ones that are struggling to get to school every day. We discovered in the study, they discovered that in New York City lowest income elementary schools, they found that more than 1/3 of the children were chronically absent for 5 years in a row in 130 elementary schools. These schools also had very low levels of academic achievement measured by standardized tests, right? They also found that chronic absenteeism correlated with deep poverty. So high rates of homelessness, child abuse reports, male unemployment, low levels of parental education. What was so interesting to me about this report is that they suggested that chronic absenteeism is a much better index of poverty than the traditional measure of the number of children eligible for free and reduced lunch. So let's move on to the next slide. Let's move to the next slide. Okay, so after talking about concentrated poverty and some of the issues that students are facing, how can we use early warning systems as a response to concentrated poverty's impact on chronic absenteeism? Okay, the next slide. Okay. So the first thing I think we have to start thinking about, I think we have to stay committed to the definition of chronic absenteeism as 10% or more of the prior year. And I try to help illustrate, if you want to start at the beginning of the school year, I encourage you to really monitor the attendance. For example, the first 2 weeks we see if you have students who are absent 2 times or more, that's a way to look at it. Or the first month, do you have students who have 2 or 3 absences? The point is, what I'm trying to make with this slide, is stay committed to the definition of chronic absenteeism as students missing 10% or more, and then trying to use early warning systems as a response. Let's move to the next slide. Okay, after you are committed to the definition of chronic absenteeism, carefully monitor the ABCs, which comes to the attendance, behavior, and course performance. Carefully examining this data. Design meetings in your school to reflect and think through the data that you are attaining. After reviewing and gathering the information, which is good to just gather the information, but also let's act on the information. In the next few slides, I want to unpack this a little bit more so that we can unpack the 3 tiers of intervention that we can use. So let's move to the next slide. Okay, so there's 3 tiers. The first tier really aims to engage with school climate. What I found out from many years of research in poor and working class communities is that the issue is intergenerational, as I keep on saying. Parents often had negative experiences in the school, and they still carry those experiences with them as adults and parents. So it's important for schools to develop positive relationships with families. These positive relationships could be developed by applauding them for who they are and their effort. While connecting with students and families, I think it's also important to constantly monitor the data that you're getting. When students are doing well and the parents when students are doing well, I think it's important to applaud them and their parents. In the process, you will probably start seeing, when you talk to parents, you'll start seeing common barriers that students and parents are bringing up. Take these common barriers back to your meetings with school personnel and try to find ways to reflect and also to mitigate the issue. So that's the tier 1. The second tier, on the other hand, looks to personalize early outreach. It aims to develop an action plan to address barriers and increase engagement. The work I am doing right now with a success mentor, I believe, is really trying to aim to get at that. And it's trying to do that by developing powerful, meaningful relationships with students who are chronically absent through mentorship. And success mentoring, I think, really falls into that, because in that it's an action plan designed to combat absenteeism in schools. In this action plan, mentors and mentee meet together 3 times a week or more, and also mentors and administrators have weekly meetings designed to go over the data and what they're finding as best practices. The last tier aims to coordinate school and interagency responses. And the last resort to this is legal intervention. So those are the 3 tiers. Let's move on to the next slide. So here are some suggested site-level strategies to combat chronic absenteeism in areas of concentrated poverty. First, in which I really aim to understand more and get a better understanding, and I think it's so important, is really engage with family members students and parents. Value the knowledge and experience that they bring to the school. Give them a sense of belonging in the school. That can only come through developing meaningful relationships with students and parents. So develop those relationships in this, with families as well as with parents and students. In addition, celebrate the good behavior and attendance. Let students and parents know that you do not see them in any deficit way, but you respect and like them for who they are. And when you see accomplishments, celebrate those accomplishments, particularly when it is attendance and academic accomplishments. Continue to monitor attendance data and practices, right? So that customize early outreach and develop an action plan within your school. The last one is, after carefully reflecting, develop systemic responses to systemic barriers. I think this is particularly true for students in working class and poor areas. I would encourage developing organic partnerships with community members in the community to help reflect and address responses to barriers that students are facing when we think about developing systematic responses to the barriers that students and parents are facing. So let's move to the next slide. In this slide, we're trying to explain a data-driven, systematic approach. So first, develop positive and genuine interactions with family members. Cultivate meaningful relationships through effective communication with students, parents, and family members. The second, actionable data. Make sure your data is accurate. Make sure it's accessible and important in a way that everyone can understand, and that's so important. It's for us all to be on page with the data and interpreting the data and understanding what we're looking at. And the third one is work together to interpret and engage in the problem solving. So after you have identified some of the problems, look for ways to engage in ways to problem solve those issues. In addition, strategic partnership. And for me, is don't be afraid to develop partnerships within a community to address some of those barriers that students are facing. And the last one is to ensure the chronic absenteeism is monitored and reinforced by policy. Okay, we can move to the next one. So in summary, poverty has an impact on academic performance, particularly chronic absenteeism, right? Research also we're aware of some of the contributing factors to chronic absenteeism. In addition, poverty can be experienced on an individual, family level, but also a communal level as well. And in that communal level, there's additional burdens that students and family members and community members are facing. And the last one is early warning systems can play a key role in combating the impact of concentrated poverty on student success. So I thank you for this time and this opportunity. I also want to mention, if we go to the next slide, that we have upcoming webinars. We have one May the 23rd, as well as May the 31st. For additional resources, you can click on that link. And for questions, you can click on that link as well. And I think that's it for me for right now.
Thank you, Richard. We haven't had any questions come into the chat function yet.
Okay.
Hi, Richard. We have a question from, something just happened. Hold on. Okay, we have a question from Alexandra Mias. She asked, are there any examples of districts that are effectively leveraging the tiered model?
Well, I know many people at the center where I work at really can speak to that, and they have a lot of examples of school districts that are really using the tiered model to really get at chronic absenteeism. And for sure, there's research really supporting that. And so I for sure can get her email, and then send her information on the tier model and the effectiveness and the multiple research we have available that's really addressing and using the tiered model.
Thank you. We don't have any further questions at this point.
Okay, so are there going to be more questions, or?
Nobody else is logging any questions into the chat function.
Okay. I also want to say that if anyone have any additional questions, they can reach out to me with my email. My email is right there. It's rlofted1@jhu.edu.
Richard, do you want to continue to wait for more questions?
I think, no, I'm good.
Okay. So thank you, everyone, for attending today. We hope you found it helpful and informative. Please keep an eye out for our emails about our upcoming website. It should be live pretty soon. And if you stay on for just another minute, I will paste the link to the Everyone Graduates Center website, which houses all of our webinars. Thank you.